30,000 feet above occupied Europe, the sky was already on fire. Flak bursts ripped open the clouds like black flowers exploding in slow motion. Engines roared against the freezing air. Inside a crippled bomber, oxygen masks hissed and radio chatter crackled through static. Tail section hit, we're losing control. Then another explosion. A violent shock tore through the aircraft. Metal screamed. Rivets snapped like gunfire. And suddenly, the back half of the bomber was gone. The tail of the aircraft sheared clean away. Somewhere in that falling wreckage was the tail gunner. Still strapped to his guns. Still alive. Above the chaos, the rest of the bomber somehow kept flying, broken, bleeding oil, missing an entire section of its body. It wasn't supposed to be possible. But in the war above Europe, the impossible happened more often than anyone expected. Because the aircraft fighting its way through the fire that day was a B-17 Flying Fortress. A bomber famous for surviving damage that should have destroyed any other machine in the sky. And this was one of the most unbelievable survival stories of the entire war. The winter sky over Europe during World War II was not empty. It was crowded with machines built for destruction. Heavy bombers droned in massive formations thousands of feet above the continent. Fighters darted like hawks between them. Anti-aircraft guns fired relentlessly from the ground, filling the air with clouds of shrapnel designed to rip metal apart. To the men inside those bombers, the sky felt less like open air and more like a battlefield made of wind and steel. Every mission began the same way. Before dawn, crews climbed into freezing aircraft on dark airfields across England. Mechanics checked engines. Bomb crews loaded tons of explosives into the bomb bays. Pilots studied maps of enemy territory where flak batteries waited along every route. Each bomber carried 10 men. Pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, engineer, and several gunners positioned throughout the aircraft to defend it from attacking fighters. They knew the odds. The missions deep into Nazi-controlled Europe were some of the most dangerous assignments in the war. And yet the bombers kept going. Because they were flying one of the most heavily armed aircraft ever built at the time, the B-17 Flying Fortress. The aircraft earned its nickname honestly. With multiple .50 caliber machine guns positioned across the fuselage, top turret, ball turret, and tail, it could defend itself from nearly any direction. Enemy pilots quickly learned that attacking a formation of B-17s meant flying straight into a wall of bullets. But its real reputation came from something even more remarkable. Survivability. The aircraft could absorb astonishing amounts of punishment and still return home. Bombers landed with engines shot out. With entire wings shredded. With holes in the fuselage large enough to see daylight through. Again and again, damaged aircraft limped back to England carrying crews who should never have survived. The Fortress had become a symbol of stubborn endurance in the air war over Europe. But even by the standards of that legendary aircraft, what happened during one particular mission seemed almost impossible. It was 1943. The daylight bombing campaign over Germany had intensified. American bombers were flying deeper and deeper into heavily defended airspace, striking factories, rail yards, and industrial centers that fueled the German war machine. These missions were brutal. Fighter escorts often could not accompany the bombers the entire distance. That meant long stretches of the journey where the formations were completely exposed to enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire. On one of those missions, a formation of B-17s pushed through thick defensive fire as they approached their target. The sky erupted around them. Flak bursts exploded at their altitude. Each blast sent invisible shards of steel tearing through the air at lethal speeds. A direct hit could rip a bomber apart instantly. Inside one of the aircraft, the crew felt the shock before they heard it. An explosion slammed into the tail section. The entire bomber shuddered violently. In the tail gunner's position at the very rear of the aircraft, the impact was devastating. That narrow compartment was one of the most exposed spots on the bomber, surrounded by glass panels and thin aluminum skin. And then came the catastrophic moment. Another blast struck nearby. The force ripped through the rear fuselage. Structural beams snapped. The bomber's tail section tore away from the aircraft. Gone in an instant. A section of metal and guns and control surfaces spinning downward toward the earth thousands of feet below. And inside it, the tail gunner. Still strapped into his seat. Still inside the wreckage as it plummeted toward the ground. Inside the forward portion of the bomber, the remaining crew struggled to understand what had just happened. The aircraft lurched violently. Control cables went slack. Warning lights flickered across the instrument panel. Somehow, the front half of the bomber remained in the air. Barely. The B-17 had lost an entire section of its body, but the wings and engines were still generating lift. The pilots fought to stabilize the crippled aircraft while the rest of the crew assessed the damage. Behind them, where the long tail once stretched outward into the sky, there was now only jagged metal and rushing wind. The bomber had been ripped open like a broken spine. Yet the aircraft refused to fall. The remaining crew realized something almost unbelievable. Despite the catastrophic damage, their aircraft was still flying. But far below them, the tail section continued its silent descent through the clouds. And inside that falling wreckage was a man who had just experienced one of the most terrifying moments any airman could face. Separated from his aircraft, falling thousands of feet through hostile skies, still strapped to his machine guns, still alive. And somehow, against every expectation of physics and war, his story was far from over. Because what happened next would become one of the most extraordinary survival stories ever told from the skies of World War II. And it would prove once again why the B-17 Flying Fortress earned a reputation that echoed across the war. A machine that refused to die, even when half of it was already gone. Why this aircraft mattered. By 1943, the air war over Europe had become one of the most decisive battlegrounds of the entire conflict. Factories, railways, oil refineries, and aircraft plants across Nazi-occupied Europe powered the German war machine. Destroying those targets was essential if the Allies wanted to weaken Germany before launching a ground invasion. The weapon chosen for that task was the heavy bomber. And among all Allied bombers, none became more iconic than the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. Designed in the late 1930s, the B-17 followed a bold concept. A bomber so heavily armed and durable that it could fight its way through enemy defenses. When the United States entered the war, the aircraft quickly became the backbone of the daylight strategic bombing campaign over Europe. Formations of these bombers departed English airfields day after day, heading hundreds of miles into enemy territory. Sometimes crews called the easier missions milk runs. But most were anything but easy. German anti-aircraft guns surrounded strategic targets, filling the sky with exploding flak designed to tear aircraft apart at high altitude. Then came the interceptors. Fighters such as the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the heavily armed Focke-Wulf Fw-190 climbed rapidly to attack the bomber formations. Their objective was simple: break the formation, isolate a bomber. Because once separated from the group, a single aircraft became far easier to destroy. For the crews inside the bombers, every mission felt like flying through a storm made of steel. Yet the B-17 quickly developed a reputation among airmen on both sides of the war. It was incredibly hard to kill. Technical advantages: why the B-17 was so tough. The B-17 was not the fastest bomber of the war, nor was it the newest design. But it possessed qualities that made it legendary. The first was defensive firepower. The aircraft carried up to 13.50 caliber machine guns, positioned to defend nearly every direction. Nose guns, dorsal turret, ball turret beneath the fuselage, waist gunners along each side, and the tail gunner. From that narrow compartment at the rear of the aircraft, one man watched the sky behind the formation. His task was simple: spot enemy fighters approaching from the rear and fire before they could close in. It was one of the most dangerous positions on the bomber. But it was also critical. The second advantage was structural durability. The B-17's airframe distributed stress through multiple structural members, allowing the aircraft to survive damage that would destroy many other planes. Its broad wings produced enormous lift, and its 4 engines allowed the bomber to keep flying even when 1, or sometimes 2, were lost. Pilots often joked that the aircraft could fly on stubbornness alone. But the truth was simpler. It had been engineered to survive combat, and many crews owed their lives to that design. Still, even the engineers who built the aircraft could never have predicted what would happen during one mission in 1943. The combat mission, when the impossible happened. The bomber formation approached its target deep inside enemy territory. Dozens of aircraft flew in tight combat boxes, carefully arranged so each bomber's guns protected the others. Engines droned steadily nearly 25,000 feet above the ground. Inside the aircraft, temperatures were far below freezing. Crew members wore heavy flight suits and oxygen masks while frost formed along the metal walls. Then the flak began. Dark explosions burst among the formation. Each blast sent fragments tearing through the sky. The bomber shook as shockwaves struck nearby. Pilots kept the aircraft steady. Breaking formation would expose them to even greater danger. Another explosion erupted close to the aircraft. Shrapnel tore through the fuselage. Warning lights flickered. The crew heard metal ripping somewhere behind them. Then came the blast that changed everything. A direct flak hit struck the rear fuselage. The explosion tore through the structure near the tail section. Inside the tail gunner's compartment, the force was devastating. The narrow position shook violently. Metal beams twisted. Glass shattered. And in seconds, the entire rear section of the bomber began to break apart. The tail, stabilizers, control surfaces, and gunner's compartment was torn away. Gone. Ripped clean from the fuselage. Inside the cockpit, the pilots felt the aircraft lurch as the sudden loss of weight disrupted its balance. Warning alarms screamed. Controls felt unstable. For a moment, it seemed certain the bomber would spin out of control. But something unexpected happened. The aircraft kept flying. Without its tail section, it should have been uncontrollable. Yet the wings were still producing lift. The engines were still running. And somehow the pilots managed to keep the crippled bomber level. Behind them, the fuselage ended in twisted metal and rushing wind. Where the tail once extended into the sky, there was now only open air. But the B-17 refused to fall. The enemy perspective, why opponents feared it. German fighter pilots had learned to respect American bombers. Attacking a B-17 formation was dangerous work. Each aircraft carried machine guns capable of destroying fighters that came too close. Pilots flying aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf-110 or the FW-190 often attacked at high speed, firing briefly before diving away. Even then, losses were common. But what frustrated German pilots most was the bomber's ability to survive extreme damage. There were many reports of bombers returning to England with catastrophic battle scars. Engines destroyed. Large sections of fuselage missing. Yet the aircraft still flew. Stories like this mission strengthened that reputation. Because even after losing an entire section of its body, the crippled bomber remained airborne long enough for the crew to attempt the impossible. They turned the aircraft toward home. Hundreds of miles of hostile territory still lay between them and safety. But the pilots had only one option. Keep flying. Keep the damaged aircraft stable. And hope the Fortress lived up to its name once again. Damaged B-17 returning to England. Heavily damaged B-17 Flying Fortress approaching an English airfield after mission. Landing gear down, sunset lighting, visible battle damage on fuselage and wings, World War II historical aviation scene. 2. Ground crew inspecting bullet damage. World War II ground crew standing beside badly damaged B-17 bomber on airfield, examining flak holes and torn aluminum panels, cloudy sky, authentic 1940s military uniforms. 3. Crew walking away from bomber. World War II bomber crew walking slowly away from their B-17 aircraft after mission, wearing flight jackets and parachutes, aircraft parked behind them, emotional but subtle historical moment. 4. Close view of battle damage. Close-up of B-17 Flying Fortress fuselage showing large flak holes and patched metal plates after combat mission, authentic World War II aircraft wear and damage. 5. Final hero shot of the Flying Fortress. Single B-17 Flying Fortress flying above golden clouds at sunset, calm sky, aircraft silhouette illuminated by sunlight, peaceful ending shot symbolizing resilience and survival.